The 20th century was a time when humanity witnessed wars of unprecedented scale among the great powers, and the most notable of them were the two world wars. We are all familiar with the events, turning points, and iconic figures of the Second World War, the conflict that changed the course of human history. But before that devastating war erupted and claimed nearly 70 million lives, the world had already endured another tragedy, the First World War. It was also known by grim names such as the Great War or the War to End All Wars. It was the first truly global conflict in human history. The First World War was no less brutal, leaving deep scars on the world order of its time and shaping the decades that followed. In fact, it became one of the direct causes leading to the Second World War. So why did the First World War happen? Why did so many believe it was a war that could not be avoided? And what was the spark that ignited this 4-year-long conflict, taking the lives of nearly 17 million people? Let's travel back in time with Stories Before Sleep to find out. The powder keg of Europe. When speaking of the First World War, people often point to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife of the Austro-Hungarian Empire as the direct event that triggered the conflict. But in truth, things were far more complicated than that. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand was merely the final spark that ignited a Europe already standing on the brink of war. Since the very beginning of the 20th century, the continent had been in a state of tension, with major powers constantly facing off and competing for territory, military dominance, and colonial influence. All those rivalries had been brewing for decades, not just a few fleeting years. And to truly understand why the Great War broke out, we need to look back at the broader picture of Europe in the 19th century and the early years of the 20th, a time when empires were quietly arming themselves for an inevitable confrontation. In the first half of the 19th century, after the Napoleonic Wars ended, Europe's great powers sought to maintain a fragile balance of power known as the Concert of Europe. However, that balance did not last long. Britain, one of the key nations that once formed alliances against Napoleon's France, soon shifted its foreign policy. It adopted a new diplomatic stance known as splendid isolation, choosing to stand apart from continental alliances and avoid interference in the internal affairs of other European states. Meanwhile, the once mighty Ottoman Empire had begun to weaken over the course of a century, losing vast territories in Europe and earning the infamous nickname, the Sick Man of Europe. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, established after the union between Austria and Hungary in 1867, was not in much better shape. With its origins as the Austrian Empire, it had suffered a devastating defeat in the Austro-Prussian War, 1866, which greatly weakened its position in Europe. Its political structure was complex and inefficient, and its many ethnic territories were loosely bound together, lacking unity. Emperor Franz Joseph I tried to maintain stability, but his empire had fallen into stagnation. So much so that the German Empire mockingly called it the corpse on the Danube. The Russian Empire fared little better. This vast power was in decline, especially after its humiliating defeat in the Russo-Japanese War, 1904-1905, when Russia was beaten by a rising Asian nation. The loss was a national humiliation, one that pushed Russia to reassert its influence in both Europe and the Balkans. At the same time, a new power was rising rapidly, the Kingdom of Prussia. After its victory in the Franco-Prussian War, 1870-1871, and under the leadership of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, Prussia became the driving force behind the creation of the German Empire in 1871. This new state, known as the Second Reich, saw itself as the successor to the Holy Roman Empire, which had dissolved in 1806. King Wilhelm I of Prussia became the first emperor of a unified Germany, known as Kaiser Wilhelm I. And within just a few years, Germany had emerged as one of Europe's leading industrial and military powers. In 1873, Bismarck initiated the Three Emperors League, a fragile alliance between Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Russia, intended to maintain peace and balance in Europe. However, this alliance quickly unraveled after the Russo-Turkish War, 1877-1878, when Russia triumphed and helped several Balkan nations, including Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, and Montenegro, gain independence from the Ottoman Empire. That victory greatly expanded Russia's influence in the Balkans, something that Austria-Hungary deeply resented. For years, Vienna had harbored its own ambitions in the region, to control key strategic territories and contain the growing wave of Slavic nationalism that threatened to destabilize the empire from within. However, due to its inefficient political system and the advanced age of Emperor Franz Joseph, the Austro-Hungarian Empire was far too slow to act. That weakness would later cause it to be drawn helplessly into the spiral of conflict that engulfed Europe. In 1879, the German Empire and Austria-Hungary formed the Dual Alliance, a defensive pact designed to protect each other in case either was attacked by Russia or any other European power. For Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, this was a strategic masterstroke, a way to prevent the young German Empire from being isolated. He believed that no nation would dare risk war against two great empires at once. By 1882, Italy joined, turning the pact into the Triple Alliance. Bismarck's goal was clear: to isolate France, the traditional enemy that Germany still viewed warily after Napoleon III's defeat in the Franco-Prussian War. In 1887, Germany and Russia even signed a secret reinsurance treaty, agreeing to remain neutral if either were attacked by another great power, except in the cases where Germany attacked France or Russia attacked Austria-Hungary. Bismarck understood that maintaining good relations with Russia was essential for preserving European stability and keeping Germany from being surrounded on multiple fronts. But everything changed when Kaiser Wilhelm II ascended the throne in 1888. Steeped in militarism and intense nationalism, the young Kaiser had little patience for Bismarck's cautious diplomacy. He wanted Germany to assert its power, not play the role of Europe's mediator. Tensions between the two men grew until 1890, when Bismarck was forced to resign. From that moment on, Wilhelm II held absolute control, pursuing an ambitious foreign policy of expansion and dominance, even dreaming of surpassing Britain as Europe's leading industrial and naval power. Many Germans at the time envisioned a greater German Commonwealth centered in Berlin, with the German Empire leading Europe's destiny. To achieve that dream, Germany needed to maintain its alliance with Austria-Hungary, a nation that shared close cultural and linguistic ties. After all, both had once been part of the Holy Roman Empire. However, Austria-Hungary was rotting from within. Its government was inefficient, its ethnic groups divided, and its political decisions often misguided. A clear example came in 1908, when Austria-Hungary formally annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina. The move sent shockwaves across Europe and provoked fierce opposition from Serbia, its southern neighbor and home to many ethnic Slavs. To Serbia, Austria-Hungary's annexation of Bosnia was nothing less than a direct threat to the dream of uniting all Slavic peoples in the Balkans. From that point onward, regional tensions erupted fiercely. Serbia and other Balkan nations, which had long resented Austria-Hungary, now had even greater reason to stir nationalist uprisings and resistance movements. Across Europe, hostilities were escalating. Between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Slavic nations and territories, ethnic hatred ran deep. Yet Austria-Hungary chose silence, hoping that somehow things would calm down on their own, that no crisis would come. But in truth, the Balkan powder keg was already packed tight. It only needed a single spark to explode. Meanwhile, after Bismarck was forced to resign in 1890, relations between Germany and Russia deteriorated. Fearing that Germany might become a threat in the future, Russia signed a military alliance with France in 1894, marking the birth of the Franco-Russian alliance. At the same time, Britain, which had long followed its policy of splendid isolation, began to shift its diplomatic stance in the early 20th century. In 1904, Britain and France signed the Entente Cordiale, resolving colonial disputes and paving the way for closer cooperation. 3 years later, in 1907, Britain reached another agreement, this time with Russia, forming the Anglo-Russian Entente. Together, these understandings gave rise to the Triple Entente, consisting of Britain, France, and Russia. However, this was not a formal military alliance. The three powers were not legally bound to assist one another if war broke out. And in truth, even with this apparent reconciliation, the rivalries and mistrust among them were far from settled. Meanwhile, Germany maintained a close relationship with the Ottoman Empire, the so-called sick man of Europe. Though weakened, the Ottomans still controlled key strategic territories, and this alliance made Russia increasingly uneasy. The reason was clear. Germany could use the Ottomans to control the Dardanelles Strait, near the Gallipoli Peninsula, through which 90% of Russia's wheat exports passed. As a result, Russia sought to expand its influence in the Balkans and support rising Slavic nationalist movements within territories under Austro-Hungarian control. This inevitably placed Russia in indirect confrontation with both Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire. Looking at the bigger picture, it became clear that nearly every major tension in Europe revolved around the Balkan Peninsula, a region aptly known as the powder keg of Europe, just waiting for a single spark to set it ablaze. Moreover, the relationship between Britain and Germany became increasingly complex and delicate. In reality, the two nations had no deep-rooted enmity. In fact, much of Germany's intellectual elite and royal family at the time deeply admired British culture, industry, and naval power. Conversely, the British also respected Germany's rapid rise in industrial achievements during and after Bismarck's era. However, driven by militaristic ambition and expansionist pride, Kaiser Wilhelm II had no desire for Germany to remain merely Britain's friendly ally. He aimed to dethrone the British Empire's global supremacy, and to do so, Germany needed a navy powerful enough to rival the Royal Navy itself. In response, Britain's First Lord of the Admiralty, Winston Churchill, proposed that the two nations mutually halt their naval expansion, offering a simple, rational argument. Britain needs a navy to guard her colonies scattered across the globe. Germany does not. But Wilhelm II refused to listen. Determined to pursue his vision, he poured billions of marks into building a massive fleet. Eventually, Germany's naval budget consumed nearly 1/3 of its total military expenditure. Ironically, when World War I finally broke out, that grand fleet achieved almost nothing of significance. It stood instead as a symbol of Wilhelm's ambition and a stark reminder of how Europe had been steadily packing more powder into its own powder keg. Germany's massive naval buildup came at a heavy price. By pouring so much of its budget into constructing a powerful fleet, the empire found itself strategically constrained. It could no longer afford to risk fighting a two-front war against both France and Russia, a conflict that would be far beyond its capacity to sustain. Meanwhile, Britain began to sense the growing danger of an inevitable clash with Germany. Becoming increasingly cautious, London chose instead to tighten its alliances with France and Russia, reinforcing the ties of the Triple Entente. Not content with that, Kaiser Wilhelm II tried to undermine Anglo-French relations by challenging French influence in Morocco. This ambition led to the First Moroccan Crisis in 1905 and the Second Moroccan Crisis in 1911. Yet the outcome was the exact opposite of what Germany intended. Britain and France did not drift apart. Their alliance became stronger, while relations with Germany deteriorated even further. Shortly after the Second Moroccan Crisis, Italy decided to launch a war against the Ottoman Empire to seize Libya. The reason was clear. Italy saw that the Ottomans had become dangerously weak, and the other great powers were unlikely to intervene. The Italo-Ottoman War, 1911-1912, was swift. In less than a year, Italy emerged victorious, taking control of Libya. That victory emboldened the Balkan states. They looked at Italy's success and thought, if even Italy can defeat the Ottomans, why can't we? And so, in October 1912, Serbia, Montenegro, Bulgaria, and Greece formed the Balkan League and declared war on the Ottoman Empire. This was the First Balkan War, 1912 to 1913. It lasted only about 6 months, ending with a decisive victory for the Balkan coalition. The Ottoman army, poorly led and outmatched on every front, collapsed quickly, losing nearly all its European territories except for a small strip of land around Istanbul in the Sea of Marmara. However, once the common enemy was defeated, old rivalries among the victors resurfaced. Disputes over the division of Macedonian territories caused deep divisions within the alliance. Just 3 months later, Bulgaria unexpectedly attacked Serbia and Greece, igniting the Second Balkan War. This time, Bulgaria suffered a swift defeat. The warring nations were forced to return to the negotiating table, redrawing borders and redefining spheres of influence. Even the Ottoman Empire, though exhausted, seized the chaotic moment to reclaim a portion of its lost lands. In the end, Europe in the early 20th century was living under nothing more than a fragile peace, calm on the surface, but beneath it lay layers of unresolved tension. And at the very center of those tensions stood the Balkans, a region where ethnic conflict, territorial ambition, and imperial rivalry intertwined into a volatile mix. After Austria-Hungary's annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina in 1908, the flames of resentment in the Balkans blazed stronger than ever. Among the nations most outraged was Serbia, which bordered Bosnia directly. Cut off from access to the Adriatic Sea and forced to watch Austro-Hungarian troops stationed along its frontier, Serbia began to feel cornered and humiliated. That anger would soon culminate in an event that changed the course of world history: the assassination in Sarajevo, where the tiniest spark would finally ignite Europe's powder keg. It's important to understand that Serbia and much of the Balkan Peninsula was home to the Slavic peoples. For centuries, they had lived under Ottoman rule and oppression, and had only recently won their independence and limited self-governance. As a result, Slavic nationalism surged stronger than ever before, with many dreaming of a unified nation for all Slavs, a vision both idealistic and deeply divisive. Thus, it's not hard to see why the Austro-Hungarian annexation of Bosnia and Herzegovina provoked such fury. To the Slavic world, it was nothing short of a deliberate provocation, an insult to their identity and their people. By the dawn of the 20th century, Serbia had become a young, fiercely proud, and intensely nationalistic nation. Having gained independence from the Ottoman Empire in 1878, it was barely 4 decades old when the Great War erupted. Yet it already harbored grand ambitions that made it a thorn in the side of Austria-Hungary. After the Second Balkan War, Serbia briefly occupied Albania, but was soon forced to withdraw under pressure from the European powers, who feared Serbia's rapid rise, especially with Russian backing. Austria-Hungary even issued an ultimatum, demanding that Serbia pull its troops out of Albania within 8 days. Serbia complied, but their resentment ran deep. Even without access to the Adriatic Sea, Serbia's territory had doubled in size after the Balkan Wars. This fed a growing belief among its people that war brought glory, particularly among the extreme nationalist factions. That nationalist fervor had already shown its dangerous side a decade earlier. In 1903, King Alexander I and Queen Draga were brutally assassinated in their palace by a group of young army officers who accused the king of being too friendly with Austria-Hungary, the nation they saw as their sworn enemy. One of the key plotters was Dragutin Dimitrijević, later hailed as a Serbian national hero. He would go on to found the secret organization known as the Black Hand, a radical nationalist movement that sought to unite all Slavs through terrorism and political assassination. Many army officers and government officials in Serbia were, in fact, covert members of this organization. After the Balkan League dissolved, Serbia became Russia's sole ally in the region, a fact that greatly alarmed both Germany and Austria-Hungary, who viewed Serbia's growing influence and confidence with increasing concern. Within Austria-Hungary, voices grew louder, calling for a preemptive strike against Serbia before it was too late to crush Slavic nationalism at its root. However, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, opposed the idea of war. He believed that attacking Serbia would be a grave mistake, though he himself harbored deep contempt for the Serbs, once referring to them as pigs, two-fingered peasants, and bandits. Those insults, combined with years of tension, humiliation, and mutual distrust, pushed the fragile relationship between the two nations to its breaking point. And then on June 28, 1914, the final spark appeared. The assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, the spark that ignited Europe. After years of simmering tension between Serbia and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, fate finally struck on a summer morning in Sarajevo. On June 28, 1914, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie arrived in Bosnia to attend the opening of a new hospital and oversee a military parade. Few could have imagined that this seemingly routine visit would become one of the most consequential moments of the 20th century. Behind the scenes, the Black Hand, a Serbian nationalist secret society, had carefully plotted an assassination. Despite receiving warnings of a possible conspiracy, Franz Ferdinand refused to cancel the trip. In total, 6 men were assigned to carry out the attack, though history remembers mainly 2 names, Nedeljko Čabrinović and Gavrilo Princip. The date was no coincidence. June 28 marked the anniversary of the Battle of Kosovo, 1389, when Ottoman Sultan Murad I was assassinated during a clash with Serbian forces. For Serbian nationalists, the day was sacred, a symbol of revenge and the rebirth of the Slavic nation. According to the plan, when the Archduke's motorcade passed by, the assassins would throw bombs at his car. When the moment came, Čabrinović hurled his grenade toward the Archduke's vehicle, but the driver accelerated at the last second, and the bomb exploded too late, injuring 10 bystanders, while Franz Ferdinand and his wife escaped unharmed. Čabrinović was quickly pursued by police. In desperation, he swallowed a cyanide capsule to end his life, but in a cruel twist of fate, the poison had expired. He vomited violently, then leapt into the Miljacka River shouting, "I am a hero of the Serbian nation." The river, shallow and rocky in summer, failed to claim him. He broke his leg on impact and was captured alive on the spot. Believing the plot had failed, Gavrilo Princip, another member of the group, wandered away in despair, stopping at a cafe near central Sarajevo. He had no idea that destiny was about to bring his target directly into his line of sight. After escaping the first attempt on his life, Archduke Franz Ferdinand remained calm and proceeded to Sarajevo City Hall, where he reprimanded the city council for its poor security arrangements. He then announced that he wanted to visit the hospital to check on those injured in the earlier bombing, ignoring the warnings of his guards. With a faint smile, he even joked, "Do you really think Sarajevo is full of assassins?" To avoid drawing too much attention, he decided to ride in an open-top car without any armed escort. But a small communication error in the security detail changed everything. The driver was never told about the updated route and accidentally turned into the very street where Gavrilo Princip was standing. The Sarajevo shot, the spark that set Europe ablaze. And so, tragedy struck, all because of one small mistake. The driver, unfamiliar with the streets of Sarajevo, followed the original route from the morning schedule. At one intersection, he took a wrong turn, forcing the motorcade to stop and slowly reverse in the middle of the street. By sheer coincidence, or fate, the car stopped right in front of a small cafe where Gavrilo Princip, the young assassin from the Black Hand, happened to be eating lunch. Stepping out of the cafe, Princip looked up and saw Archduke Franz Ferdinand and Duchess Sophie seated in their open-top car just a few meters away. Without hesitation, he pulled out his pistol, approached the car, and fired 2 shots at point-blank range. One bullet struck Franz Ferdinand, the other hit Sophie. The couple collapsed into each other's arms. As Princip tried to take his own life, police and bystanders rushed forward and overpowered him, but it was already too late. At 11:30 a.m. that morning, both Franz Ferdinand and Sophie were pronounced dead. The shots fired in Sarajevo echoed across the continent, shaking Europe to its core. The Archduke's death was like a match dropped into a barrel already full of gunpowder. Though he had never been popular and had even opposed war, the murder of the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne set the empire ablaze with outrage, and the world would never be the same again. Within the imperial court, one faction wanted Serbia to bow and concede, as it had after the Albania affair in 1913, when Serbia was forced to withdraw its troops under pressure from the great powers. But the other faction saw this as a golden opportunity to declare war, to crush Serbia's ambitions and extinguish the wave of Slavic nationalism in the region. Austria-Hungary promptly informed Germany of its intention to attack Serbia. Given the close alliance, Germany pledged full support, provided Austria-Hungary acted quickly. German leaders believed that if Austria-Hungary struck early, before world opinion could react, Serbia would be isolated, and even Russia would not have time to intervene. They argued this would allow the matter to be handled cleanly, without turning into a continent-wide war. However, within Austria-Hungary, the Hungarian faction was more cautious. They wanted war only as a warning to Serbia, not annexation or territorial conquest. At first, Hungary opposed military action, out of respect for the moderate views of Franz Ferdinand, who had opposed conflict. But the Austrian faction skillfully used his death to persuade Hungary, portraying the campaign as an opportunity to avenge the honor of the late heir. Once consensus was reached, the next thing they needed was a legal pretext to act. And so, just weeks after the assassination, Austria-Hungary drafted and sent an ultimatum to Serbia, the document the world would later remember as the ultimatum that set off World War I. The July crisis, when peace hung by a thread. As the shadow of war loomed over Europe, 2 diplomats still recognized just how catastrophic a full-scale conflict would be. They were Count Vladimir von Giesel, the Austro-Hungarian ambassador, and Nicholas Hartwig, the Russian envoy, both stationed in Belgrade, the capital of Serbia. Though representing rival empires, neither man wanted war. They arranged a private meeting at von Giesel's residence to discuss a joint peace proposal, hoping to cool tensions before events spiraled out of control. But in a cruel twist of fate, during their conversation, Hartwig suddenly suffered a heart attack and died on the spot. His unexpected death shocked the public. Rumors spread quickly. Many accused Austria-Hungary of poisoning the Russian ambassador, and the atmosphere across Europe grew more volatile than ever. On July 23, 1914, Austria-Hungary officially delivered an ultimatum to Serbia. The document contained 10 demands insisting that Serbia fully cooperate in the investigation and respond within 48 hours. The timing was no coincidence. Austria-Hungary deliberately waited until French President Raymond Poincaré was visiting Tsar Nicholas II in Russia, hoping to prevent Serbia from receiving immediate diplomatic support from its two strongest allies. Among the 10 demands, one stood out as the most outrageous. Austro-Hungarian police and officials shall be permitted to enter Serbia and have full authority to conduct an investigation into the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. Everyone knew this condition was unacceptable. It would have meant surrendering Serbia's national sovereignty. But Austria-Hungary didn't expect Serbia to comply. They only wanted a legal pretext to go to war. Upon hearing the news, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Sazonov uttered a line that would echo through history. This is no longer a matter between Austria and Serbia. This is a war for all of Europe. On July 24, 1914, Russia sought to buy time for Serbia, urging Britain and France to intervene diplomatically in hopes of averting war. That same day, Belgium declared its neutrality, hoping to stay clear of the storm that was rapidly gathering over Europe. That evening in Petrograd, now St. Petersburg, Foreign Minister Sergei Sazonov engaged in a heated exchange with German Ambassador Friedrich von Portalès. Portalès warned that any mobilization by Russia could ignite a world war, saying, "If that happens, the entire heritage of Europe will collapse." But Sazonov was resolute. He believed that if Austria-Hungary swallowed Serbia, Russia would lose all influence in the Balkans, something utterly unacceptable. He declared firmly, if Serbia is wiped off the map, Russia will declare war. In truth, within Austria-Hungary, the Hungarian leadership had no intention of annexing Serbia. But no one outside the empire knew that. Russia remained convinced that Serbia would be absorbed, and thus diplomacy gave way to military preparation. Before the 48-hour deadline expired, Serbia delivered its response to the ultimatum. As expected, Belgrade accepted nearly all conditions, except the one allowing Austro-Hungarian police to operate on Serbian soil. Serbia even added a pointed remark at the end of its reply. If the Austro-Hungarian government is not satisfied, it may refer the matter to the International Tribunal. The tone was unmistakable, a slap in the face to Vienna. Infuriated, Austro-Hungarian Foreign Minister Count Leopold von Berchtold immediately sought an audience with Kaiser Wilhelm II of Germany to discuss the next move. And within days, the world would cross the final threshold between peace and war. The final days before the war. As Europe stood on the edge of chaos, Kaiser Wilhelm II, the Emperor of Germany, was ironically away on vacation. In his absence, the remaining members of the German cabinet, most of them hardliners, harshly criticized Austria-Hungary for not declaring war sooner. Even Austria-Hungary's chief of staff was frustrated and caught off guard. Mobilizing the army at this stage would now take far too long. Meanwhile, Russia had already begun quietly preparing for mobilization. On July 28, 1914, Count Leopold von Berchtold finally persuaded Emperor Franz Joseph to sign the declaration of war against Serbia, even though the Austro-Hungarian army was nowhere near ready for a full-scale conflict. The first shot had been fired, and the world began to slip irreversibly away from peace. When Kaiser Wilhelm II returned to Berlin and learned of the situation, he hesitated. Together with Britain, he proposed forming an international conference to seek a peaceful resolution, rather than immediately supporting Austria-Hungary's military action, as he had earlier promised. But by then, events had already spiraled beyond control. Each side believed the other was preparing for war, and the point of no return was fast approaching. Still trying to salvage peace, Wilhelm sent a message suggesting that Austro-Hungarian forces halt at Belgrade to demonstrate they had no intention of annexing Serbian territory. This message was passed to German Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg, who then relayed it to Vienna, but without any real effort to enforce the idea. By now, the German leadership was deeply divided, and no one seemed capable of stopping the gears of war already in motion. Meanwhile, in St. Petersburg, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Sazonov was enraged upon hearing that Austria-Hungary had declared war. He immediately urged Tsar Nicholas II to mobilize the Russian army in defense of Serbia. But before making the final decision, in the early hours of July 29th, the Tsar sent a telegram to Kaiser Wilhelm II, his cousin, in a last attempt to avoid catastrophe. The telegram carried a tone of urgency and deep anxiety. In this critical moment, I beg your help. A senseless war is about to break out against a small and weak nation. Both the Russian people and I myself are furious, but I fear that domestic pressure will force me to act. For the sake of our friendship, I ask you to restrain your allies by any means. Kaiser Wilhelm II replied the same night, I understand your difficulty, and I understand the pressure you are under. For the sake of our sincere friendship, I will do my utmost to persuade Austria-Hungary to seek a solution. I hope you will remain calm so that together we may get through this moment. The two sovereigns, kinsmen of the same royal bloodline, exchanged telegrams through the night and for several days afterward, clinging to a faint hope for peace. But the machinery of war had already begun to move, and no one could stop it now. Willie and Nicky, the last telegrams before the storm. By 1st August 1914, in the telegrams they exchanged, Kaiser Wilhelm II and Tsar Nicholas II no longer addressed each other by imperial titles. They called one another familiarly Willie and Nicky, like old friends, or more precisely cousins, trying to cling to whatever family bond remained amid the crisis. Both understood that a terrible war could erupt at any moment, and ironically, while all of Europe was being swept into a political and military whirlpool, the two most powerful men on the continent were sincerely trying to prevent it. Despite past mistakes and misunderstandings, at least in that moment, Willie and Nicky were taking the right steps. Sadly, the river of history would not let them stop it. On the evening of 29th of July, under mounting pressure from his generals, Tsar Nicholas II ordered a temporary halt to mobilization, hoping it would signal de-escalation. But less than a day later, wounded pride and pressure from the Russian court shattered those efforts. At a council on 30th of July, ministers pressed the Tsar for a final decision. Either mobilize the army or accept the destruction of Serbia. Nicholas hesitated and said quietly, "Think of the responsibility you are forcing me to bear. Remember, this is a decision that will send countless people to their deaths." The room fell silent until General Ilya Tatishchev, who had been quiet all along, sighed almost plaintively. "Yes, it is indeed very hard to decide." That single remark seemed to trigger an emotional outburst from the Tsar. He struck the table and declared, "Then I will decide. Mobilize the army." And so, from a moment of wounded pride and weakness, Russia formally ordered general mobilization. When Kaiser Wilhelm II received word of that decision on 30th of July, he replied at once, "If Russia mobilizes, Germany will do the same." The dominoes began to fall. Foreign Minister Sergei Sazonov immediately phoned Chief of Staff Nikolai Yanushkevich, informing him that the Tsar had ordered a general mobilization. With a touch of bitter irony, he added, "You'd better smash the telephone before the Tsar changes his mind again." But the real question was why Nicholas II suddenly made that decision, when everyone knew him as a kind but indecisive man, easily swayed by those around him. The answer lay in his own insecurities. Throughout his reign, Nicholas II had been seen as being under the influence of the mystic Rasputin, a monk rumored to hypnotize the empress and wield uncanny power over the royal court. Among the Russian nobility, the Tsar was despised for his weakness. Among the people, he was mocked as a man too timid to rule his own empire. That humiliation, that wounded pride, drove Nicholas II to prove he was still the ruler of Russia. And he did so with the most disastrous decision of his life. From that moment on, the wheels of war began to turn. And no one, not even the two cousins, Willie and Nicky, could stop them anymore. When every door to peace closed, the final attempt to stop war came on August 1st, 1914, when German ambassador Friedrich von Portales visited Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Sazonov in Petrograd. Portales carried a grim task: to deliver Germany's final ultimatum to Russia. Moscow must halt its mobilization within 12 hours, or Germany would declare war. Yet when they met, Portales hesitated. He didn't hand over the document immediately. Instead, he pleaded, "Please stop this before it's too late." He still hoped Russia might respond with reason, or at least show some sign of restraint. But Sazonov refused. He explained that the general mobilization order had already been issued, something impossible to undo overnight. Besides, and he said, mobilizing the army doesn't mean Russia wants war. We only want to pressure Austria-Hungary so they can't crush Serbia. But by then, reason had already left the room. Every nation was mobilizing. Ultimatums were being exchanged. Threats were turning into bullets. When Portales finally realized there was no other way, he silently handed over Germany's declaration of war. The news hit Paris like a shockwave. French generals knew it was over. War was now inevitable. The day before, July 31st, Britain had sent a note asking both France and Germany to respect Belgium's neutrality, that small country wedged between the two powers. France agreed. Germany said nothing. Fearing a surprise attack through Belgium, General Joseph Joffre, France's commander-in-chief, asked permission to advance across the border for defense. But Paris refused, ordering instead that French troops pull back 10 kilometers to avoid violating Belgian territory, and to wait, only fire if Germany strikes first. That restraint didn't last long. On August 1st, an enraged Kaiser Wilhelm II ordered the occupation of Luxembourg, the first move in Germany's grand plan for war. 2 days later, on August 3rd, Germany declared war on France and demanded permission to move its army through Belgium. Belgium refused. Then, in the early hours of August 4th, German troops invaded Belgium, launching the Schlieffen Plan, the strategy of lightning war: strike down France in the west, then turn east to face Russia. King Albert III of Belgium appealed to the world for help. Britain issued an ultimatum demanding Germany withdraw its forces, and when no answer came, Britain declared war at midnight. The First World War had begun, a conflict that would last over 4 years, claim 17 million lives, destroy an entire generation, and reshape the world forever. And the cruel irony of history was this: the war once hailed as the war to end all wars turned out to be only the prelude to something far worse: the Second World War. And that is the full story of the events that led to the tragedy we call World War I. Looking back, the First World War was not only a blood-soaked catastrophe, it was also a profound lesson about the arrogance and blindness of mankind. Because of political ambition, empty declarations of honor, and the fragile pride of empires, an entire generation of young men was left buried beneath the fields of Europe. Wars rarely begin for one reason alone. They ignite from hundreds of small mistakes, stacked one upon another, until no one has the courage to stop them. The world back then thought of itself as civilized, modern, proud of its progress in industry and science. Yet it was that very brilliance that humans turned upon one another. In trenches, in clouds of poison gas, and under the thunder of machine guns. Perhaps the greatest lesson history left us is this: war never truly solves anything, because in the end, the victors bleed too, the defeated suffer just as much, and humanity carries the scars of its own folly for generations to come. So if you're listening to this right now, take a moment to reflect on the value of peace, something we often take for granted, yet was bought with blood, tears, and the awakening of millions before us. If today's story gave you a new perspective on history, leave a like to show your support, share this video to spread the message of peace, and subscribe to Stories Before Sleep, where together we'll keep uncovering the true stories and timeless lessons that history has left behind.